Absolutely. And hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this postponed session of the autumn series of the Helsinki Mind and Matter seminar. I'm really glad to see so many people here, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome our two speakers today, Keith Frankish and Philip Goff. So Keith is an honorary professor in the philosophy department at the at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He's a visiting research fellow at the Open University in the UK, and he's an adjunct professor with the Brain and Mind program in neurosciences at the University of Crete, Greece. Keith has authored two books, Consciousness and Mind and Supermind. He's published numerous academic articles, edited 5 academic volumes, and is the editor of the Cambridge University Press Elements in Philosophy of Mind series. And alongside all of this, he also finds the time to write for a wide range of magazines. Philip Goff is an associate professor of philosophy at Darwin University, where his main research focus is consciousness. He's the author of 2 books, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, and Galileo's Error, Foundations for a New Science of Consciousness. And I believe from our discussion earlier, he's also got another book in press at the moment. Philip's also the author of numerous academic articles and also writes extensively for newspapers and magazines. And Keith and Philip are going to be talking to us today on the topic of all or nothing, why illusionism and panpsychism may be the only options on consciousness. And without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Oh, I was just about to start the recording, but it's saying recording. Is that because Keith's recording, or? Okay, well, it's saying recording, even though I didn't seem to start the recording. Okay, well, are you recording, Keith?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe I am as well, maybe I'm not, but because it's just okay. Okay, sorry. Let's share some slides.
You both appear to be recording.
Right, okay, thank you, Tulu. Okay, everyone hear me and see me okay? Okay, so I'm just going to talk for 20 minutes, give a kind of basic overview of my views on the problem of consciousness, finishing with some brief thoughts on why I'm not an illusionist, and then hopefully Keith will talk for 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm just going to give a brief overview, but if people want to go into more details, we can do that in the Q&A. So it's kind of broadly agreed that consciousness poses one of the deepest intellectual puzzles of our time. And while there are certainly deep challenges here, I'm inclined to think we sometimes make the problem harder for ourselves by mischaracterizing it. I think still many people think of the problem of consciousness as a purely scientific problem, and think, we just need to crack on with our standard ways of investigating the brain and we'll one day crack it, we'll one day solve the puzzle. Whereas I'm inclined to think what we have at root here is a philosophical rather than a purely scientific problem. And I actually think when we treat it as such, when we treat it as a philosophical problem, actually things become a little bit more straightforward. So I think I'm starting to think maybe part of the problem is we take this philosophical problem, we label it a scientific problem, and then we think, oh, why isn't science solving it, right? Whereas once we just appreciate this as a philosophical problem, it starts to look a bit less like a profound mystery. Still obviously a deep challenge, but less like a profound mystery. So for this reason, I've stopped using this term hard problem of consciousness, which is the familiar way of introducing the problem, because this is not how David Chalmers intended it. I think he intended it as a philosophical problem, but I think many people take that on as a scientific problem, rather than even in part a philosophical one. So I think I've gone back to using the more traditional philosophical term of the mind-body problem. And I think of this as a challenge which arises because we have two very different ways in which we access objective reality, perception and introspection. So through perception, we access the physical world via our senses, and we've learned to do that in more precise ways through what we call science. Through introspection, we access consciousness via our immediate awareness of our feelings and experiences. The mind-body problem then is the challenge of how do we bring together these two seemingly very different things, consciousness and the physical world, into a single unified theory of reality. And broadly speaking, there are three philosophical solutions to this philosophical problem. I mean, actually, these aren't quite exhaustive, and we can go into sort of middle options and so on in the Q&A. But I think a nice way to introduce it is to start with these three options. So firstly, materialism, the view that the physical world, as revealed by physics, is fundamental, and facts about consciousness, and is the only fundamental reality, and facts about consciousness are grounded in the facts of physics. That should be grounded rather than ground. Panpsychism, or maybe idealism, turns that on its head, that it's consciousness that's fundamental, some facts about consciousness. I mean, I'm not meaning consciousness like it's something necessarily, but some facts about consciousness. And then the facts of physics are grounded in more fundamental facts about consciousness. Dualism, finally, takes both consciousness and the physical world as equally fundamental but distinct. And many contemporary so-called naturalistic dualists like David Chalmers or Martin de Hummelen will postulate fundamental psychophysical laws of nature that connect up consciousness and the physical world in a law-governed way. So even though consciousness is not physical, they want to bring it into the domain of science by postulating these special psychophysical laws that connect consciousness to the physical world. So crucially, each of these options, at least in all of these options, at least in certain forms, are empirically equivalent, in the sense that you're not going to be able to distinguish between them in any straightforward way with an experiment. And I think that's not surprising. As I say, what we're dealing with here is a philosophical, not a purely experimental problem. Similarly, you wouldn't expect an experiment to determine in any straightforward way whether the pro-choice or pro-life position in abortion ethics is the correct one, because this is a philosophical rather than an experimental problem. Similarly, here, this is a philosophical problem. Now, of course, that's not to say that experiments are useless. Of course, experiments are hugely important in the science of consciousness for all sorts of reasons. But as in relation to the mind-body problem, I think the primary thing we can learn from experiments is what kinds of physical activity in brains go along with consciousness. So one major difficulty here is that consciousness is not publicly observable. I can't look inside your brain and see your feelings and experiences. But if you're a human being, I can standardly ask you what you're feeling and experiencing. And if I do that while I scan your brain, or I maybe stimulate bits of your brain, or maybe I can look for external markers of consciousness instead of asking you, then we can start to try and correlate which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of experience, or getting more systematic in general, what kinds of brain activity are necessary and sufficient for consciousness. Now, there's kind of no consensus here. Famously, Christoph Koch, the neuroscientist, bet David Chalmers a crate of fine wine in the 90s that in 25 years this would all be wrapped up. But you know, there's really no consensus. There's a few different models. I favor the integrated information theory, which is the view that consciousness is correlated with maximal integrated information in the brain, or something like the integrated information theory, but on philosophical rather than empirical grounds, which we could perhaps talk about in the Q&A. But in any way, there are these different proposals. So one of them is integrated information theory, or IIT. I'm not going to go into what they mean by maximal integrated information. It's something they try to give a mathematical definition of. But in any case, there are other proposals, the global workspace theory being perhaps the other leading contender, or one of the other leading contenders. So this is, important data, important project to try and work out how consciousness and physical brain activity are correlated. But crucially, each of these proposals, let's just work with IIT to take one example, are just neutral on all these different philosophical solutions to the mind-body problem. So let's taking IIT, each of the different philosophical theories will just account for this in different ways. Suppose we one day find that IIT is the true scientific theory of consciousness. That is to say that the theory of when and only when you get consciousness in the brain. Okay, consciousness is correlated with maximal integrated information. Suppose that's one day as empirically secure as, I don't know, general relativity or something. Well, each of these different philosophical solutions to the mind-body problem will just account for that in different ways. So a materialist would say that, well, consciousness is that shows that consciousness is identical with or constituted of maximal integrated information. The panpsychist will say, well, maximal integrated information is grounded in underlying facts about consciousness. And the dualist will say, well, these psychophysical laws that connect consciousness up to the physical world connect consciousness up to maximal integrated information in the brain. That's just how these basic laws of nature work. So settling these scientific questions of consciousness just leaves open all these philosophical options. I mean, that's not quite true. There can be various, I think, certain philosophical views can impact the experimental views and vice versa. But broadly speaking, these are two separate endeavors. What was I going to say next? So I think, this is really important because I'm inclined to think the reason materialism continues to be so popular, the recent Phil Papers survey of philosophers' opinions in 2020, so materialism is just over 50% favored by philosophers or agree or inclined towards. Anti-materialism is just over 30%, and then there's 15-20% don't like the question or something. So there's there's a healthy disagreement there, but materialism continues to be the by a fairly significant margin the most popular view. I'm inclined to think a lot of this, especially in the broader scientific community and general public, is because people think of it as the scientific option, right? Whereas I just think that's not true. The scientific data on consciousness just leaves open all of these options. What we need to do is treat this as a philosophical disagreement, treat these as different philosophical options, and try and assess them on that basis in their own terms as the philosophical theories in terms of what they are trying to do. Okay, so what happens when we try to do that? When we try to assess these different options as philosophical theories? Well, it's a huge debate that I'm not going to settle in 10 minutes now. But here on one slide is basically my view. In terms of materialism, I think the problem is we've never made any progress on its central explanatory task of trying to make sense of how consciousness could be grounded in facts of physical science. And I think there are good arguments that it can't be done, like the knowledge argument, or a sort of modified version of the knowledge argument. So it's a huge debate, but the basic thought here is that the kind of concepts we find in physical science and the kinds of concepts that characterize conscious experience are just so radically different that you can't build explanatory bridges between the two. So one aspect of this is physical science works with a purely quantitative vocabulary, whereas the kind of concepts we employ when we characterize our conscious experience are qualitative. In our conscious experience, we find these kind of colors, sounds, smells, tastes, And these are just very different kinds of concept. And this is why zombies are conceivable, for example, physical creatures just like us, but without consciousness, because these are just two very different kinds of concept. Another interesting fact from the Phil Papers survey, actually, 60% of philosophers think zombies are conceivable, presumably because, in the large part, because they're just very, very different, the kinds of concepts we employ when we think about our conscious experience and the kinds of concepts we employ in physical science. They're just very different kinds of concept. I mean, that doesn't settle anything. It's not a popularity contest, but I think it should give us pause for thought when there's a significant consensus of philosophers there. Okay, so I mean, that's my problem with materialism. I think it's never made progress on its central explanatory task that I think it should set itself. I'm glad I changed what I said there. And I think there are good reasons to think, because there are very different concepts here, that it just can't be done. Now, you might be thinking that I haven't said anything. I mean, that if you know a bit more about the academic philosophy here, actually the most popular materialist position, the so-called phenomenal concept strategy, says actually we don't need to build these explanatory bridges. We can just postulate sort of brute identities. Okay, I have things to say about that. I mean, a lot of my work has been arguing against that view. And this is interesting, actually, where I disagree with David Chalmers. We have a very different way of responding to that popular materialist view. When I was doing my PhD, I was quite glad when I realized I didn't agree with David Chalmers. It wasn't a forced disagreement, but it's, I've got something to say now. Okay, so we have different, anyway, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But yeah, basically you get the 60% who think zombies are conceivable. If you add that most popular materialist position to the anti-materialists, that's why you get that big consensus that zombies are conceivable, that physical and phenomenal concepts are very different. So this whole project that I think many scientists think of, building explanatory bridges between consciousness and the physical world, I debate Anil Seth a lot, for example. I think, 60% of philosophers, that's just not going to work out because these concepts are very different. Okay, anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So that's my problem with materialism. Panpsychism, in contrast, in terms of their central explanatory task, I would say, central explanatory task of trying to make sense of how the physical world could be grounded in underlying facts about consciousness, I would say just we've already worked out how to do this. The problem is essentially solved. And here I think we should think of Bertrand Russell as sort of the Darwin of consciousness, the approach he explored in his 1927 book, The Analysis of Matter. So I think what Russell was thinking really hard about around this time was the fact that physics, our fundamental science, is purely mathematical, pretty much, or purely quantitative. We include kind of causal concepts or concepts like a law of nature that are not strictly mathematical. But anyway, broadly speaking, physics is just kind of equations. Now, if you're a working scientist, that's really useful because you can get very precise predictions. But what does it mean as a philosopher interested in the fundamental nature of reality, that our fundamental science is purely mathematical? Well, I think what it means is that our fundamental science isn't really telling us very much about the fundamental nature of reality. It's merely describing its mathematical structure. And so fundamental reality could turn out to be anything, the only constraint is that it has the right mathematical structure, the mathematical structure specified by physics. So fundamental reality could be anything. As long as it has the right mathematical structure, you're going to be able to get physics out of that. So there's a new generation, if I can put it that way, of Bertrand Russell-inspired panpsychist philosophers. Some of us anyway. There's quite a lot of publications in the last 10 years. So, and panpsychism adjacent views, maybe, who try to borrow this insight from Russell to try and make sense of a form of panpsychism. So the thought would be, or one way of spelling this out is, at the fundamental level of reality, we have these networks of very simple conscious entities behaving in very simple, predictable ways because of their very simple experiences. Through their interactions, they realize certain patterns and mathematical structures. And then the thought is, those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So we kind of get physics out of underlying facts about consciousness. So people often quote this line from the final page of A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, where he said, even the final theory of physics won't tell us what breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe. So for the Russellian panpsychist, it's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So, so coming back to this contrast, I think we've got a very stark contrast here. Materialism has never made progress, in my view, on its central explanatory task, whereas panpsychism has already completed it. It's already solved the puzzle, right? So to my mind, it's quite clear what's the more attractive view here. Dualism, I think, is coherent and empirically possible. I mean, in my early work, I argued dualism wasn't empirically plausible. The more I've talked to neuroscientists, I don't think we know enough about the brain to say that. We could talk about that in the Q&A. So I think materialism is a possibility empirically and philosophically, but as scientists and philosophers, we should respect Occam's razor. We try to have more simple, parsimonious views, and I think that presses us to one of the first two options, that consideration. Why believe in two kinds of thing when you can just believe in one, right? So I think there's a very strong philosophical case for panpsychism. It's doing much better than materialism on its central explanatory task, and it's simpler than dualism. That's it, really. Okay, but is it really so simple? What's often seen as the Achilles heel for... I might go on for 25 minutes if that's okay, but I'll definitely finish by past. Is the so-called combination problem. Roughly speaking, this challenge to making sense of how simple conscious entities combine to form conscious complex entities like ourselves. So it's no good just postulating conscious particles or conscious fields. So we have fields, forms of panpsychism, as well as I haven't talked about particles for the sake of simplicity, but I'm probably more inclined to a fields conception of panpsychism, where the fundamental forms of consciousness underlie universe-wide fields. Anyway, I'll just carry on talking about particles for the sake of simplicity. So it's no good postulating conscious particles if we can't make sense of how they come together to make our consciousness or the consciousness of other non-human animals, right? And in fact, in my earliest publications, I think among my most cited publications, I argued, before my conversion to panpsychism, I argued that the explanatory gap that emerges here for the panpsychist between sort of particle consciousness and systems level consciousness is just as problematic as the explanatory gap facing the materialist. So panpsychism gets us nowhere. So, and I've spent the rest of my career trying to solve that, respond to that challenge I set myself. But I think what I would now say is that challenge is really only a challenge for very reductive forms of panpsychism, which say that, really in some sense, all that exists are conscious particles. And what we call, say, Keith's brain, let me say that again. What we call Keith's mind is just a complex combination network of conscious particles. So Luke Roelofs, for example, has done a lot of good work in his excellent book, Combining Minds, trying to make sense of that. For various reasons, I'm less and less sympathetic to that pure reductionist picture. I would rather go for some kind of strong emergentist form of panpsychism, where we have a more layered picture of reality, where biological minds and or consciousness constitute a kind of extra layer of reality to the consciousness at the level of physics. And now there's going to be some kind of explanatory relationship between these two layers, but it will be not grounding, but causation. So we might, for example, ascribe to particles basic combinatorial capacities, which dispose them in certain circumstances to combine into unified conscious wholes. And of course, we will look to neuroscience to guide us in understanding what those circumstances are. Okay, so in other words, we postulating these basic combinatorial capacities by definition closes that explanatory gap associated with the combination problem. But at this point, you might think, well, actually, I should say, slight ramble there. At this point, you might say, Or why not just be a dualist? If you're going to postulate these kind of basic combinatorial capacities, why not just have bog standard non-conscious particles and just ascribe to them basic capacities to come together and make conscious things? Postulating consciousness to particles starts to look redundant. And my answer there is quite simply, again, parsimony. Why believe in two kinds of thing when you can believe in one? The dualist postulates two kinds of fundamental property, physical ones and experiential ones. The panpsychist just postulates one. Put it another way, if we can get everything we need, account for all the data of physical science, facts about consciousness, just from postulating experience, then that's what we should do. We shouldn't postulate beyond necessity. Or put it another way, I think, panpsychism earns its keep, as it were, through this reduction of the physical world to facts about consciousness. If it can also reduce biological consciousness, and actually in my forthcoming paper, which you can get in my website, I need to make some changes before the journal publishes it. How exactly does panpsychism explain consciousness? I have a kind of partial reductionist picture, so that's an added bonus. But even if we can't tell any kind of reductionist story in terms of layers of consciousness, I think panpsychism still earned its keep from the reduction of the physical world to consciousness. Okay, finally, the last couple of minutes. Well, why not illusionism? Illusionism, does give us a very elegant, I can see the appeal, gives us a very elegant solution to these problems. Just say that consciousness, at least as philosophers attempted to talk about it, I know that Keith does think consciousness exists in some sense of that word, but as philosophers attempt to think about it, that leads to all these mind-body problem challenges, it just doesn't really exist. So consciousness exists in some sense, but not in any sense that it's in any way problematic to explain, to account for in terms of physical science. So I guess my view in response to that, I'm not so much going to give an argument, but just how things seem to me in a way. I think there's a special kind of knowledge or justification that we have in respect to our conscious experience that needs to be factored in here. And perhaps the best way to describe it is to talk not so much about the phenomenon itself, but the concepts we use to describe it. So technical term here, phenomenal concepts. This is the term that's arisen in the philosophical literature to refer to the concepts we employ when we attend to our experiences and think about them in terms of what it's like to have them. So I attend to my pain, and I think about it in terms of how it feels, what it's like. I thereby form a phenomenal concept. So I want to say these phenomenal concepts give us a very special kind of justification, namely that we have a kind of non-empirical justification, non-empirical in the sense of public observation and experiments. Think about empirical as public observation experiments. You might think this is empirical in another sense. Okay, anyway, namely, we have strong justification just on the basis of tending to our experience to think that some phenomenal concepts are satisfied. So notice that important qualification. I'm not saying we never mischaracterize our conscious experience. Maybe we sometimes apply the wrong phenomenal concept. What I want to say is that we know that some members of that class are satisfied. But if that's true, this is very important data, a very important data point, right? Because I think in general, none of our concepts have this special status. In general, we look to science to tell us what the right concepts are for reality, right? So, suppose I've got my ordinary concept of solidity, maybe that in a solid object, it's totally filled in. And then maybe science tells us nothing solid in that sense. Physicists say now that that's not true. Anyway, but let's suppose science did tell me nothing solid in that sense. Well, I ought to give up my concept. I can't say, well, no, that scientific theory must be wrong because I know things are solid. No, I think we should give up the concept. Whereas in this case, I think our concepts of consciousness, we know in the sense I've articulated, we know that broad class of concepts, that family of concepts gets reality right. And so we have this explanatory obligation that any theory of reality has to respect that fact. These concepts get stuff right. So this is a really important data for metaphysical inquiry. I think philosophers of the future will look back and think it's really odd that late 20th century, early 21st century metaphysicians didn't make more of this data point, right? I just think it's hugely neglected and important. And this is also, you know, why we're having problems with consciousness. I think, you know, this is why it's not just a scientific problem. There's a sort of, in a way, a philosophical datum here that we need to take into account. And so, you know, we're not going to deal properly with consciousness until we radically rethink the way we think about science and the way we think about the project of finding out about reality. I think the public just think it's just doing experiments and that's it. You know, and I know philosophers don't necessarily think that, but I don't think anyone outside of academic philosophy perhaps has got the memo. You know, I don't think people know that we do this thing called metaphysics. So occasionally you get these op-eds in the Guardian or something saying philosophers have started doing metaphysics. You've sort of been doing it since the 70s. Anyway, so there's this big change called for here. Now you might say, now, you know, Keith might say, sorry, I'm going over time, I'm nearly finished. You know, if you, Keith, you might say, well, how do you know? How do you know that that's just an intuition? How do you know that, Keith and I have had this argument a lot, you know, that these concepts correspond to reality? And at this point, when we start to get to bedrock, I guess I'd be tempted to say, well, how do you know you're not in the matrix? How do you know 2 + 2 is 4? I think the human epistemological situation is not ideal. All we can do with philosophy is just start with what seems to us most evident and work up from there. Now, what I've just articulated to you, this non-empirical justification, it seems to be more evident that that is the case than that there's an external world. And therefore it seems entirely rational for me to take that as a starting point for inquiry. And, you know, that's not an argument. If Keith or anybody else it doesn't seem evident to them, then I don't think I can say anything to persuade them. But I suppose what I'm trying to do, I suppose, is give people who do find themselves, I think a lot of people, maybe most people, a lot of people do find themselves in the same epistemological state as me, giving them the confidence in opposition to our sort of scientific culture to say, look, that's the rational thing to do is to follow where that leads you in the way I've been articulating. One more thing, you know, a starting point isn't a stopping point. Just because I'm saying there is a sort of non-empirical starting point here, I haven't used the word certainty or infallibility here. I've said very strong justification. If there was some incredible argument for illusionism, then this could overturn this starting point, this non-empirical starting point. But I'm yet to hear that great argument. A lot of arguments for illusion, not all seem to me to start with just an assumption that the only way we find out about reality is through experiments. And I don't know what justifies that assumption. Okay, I've talked too much. Here's a picture of my book. Oh, my academic book is probably more relevant for philosophers, consciousness and fundamental reality. But anyway, I'll need to stop talking. Thank you very much for listening. Stop share.
Thanks very much, Philip, and we'll pass straight on to Keith now for his part of the presentation.
Hi, thanks. I'm conscious that we're getting through the time. How long should I talk for?
We've got until 1:30, so we've still got quite a bit of time. So okay. 25 minutes or so with that.
Okay, I should better do that. Okay, so let me share my screen. Just a moment. There we go. Is that appearing?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Philip. That's a nice introduction to the topic, I think. And Philip's very clear about the assumptions that drive his position. And really, I suppose I don't share those assumptions. And I don't share I think, a fundamental assumption that underlies it all. So let me say what that is. Hold on, let me see if I can just go through. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is an argument for illusionism. I was going to call it the master argument for illusionism, but I don't think there is a master argument for it. I think lots of considerations come together, but this is one argument. There is no magical awareness of anything. And really, I could stop there because that sums it all up, actually. Everything else follows from that. Awareness requires a mechanism. Be aware of things around me. I need perceptual mechanisms that detect those things and collect data about them, data that can then be processed by my sensory systems and by other brain systems. And these mechanisms might be representational, and it's convenient to talk about them as representation. It's the common language of cognitive science, but it's not the only option. There are other ways. There are other ways of thinking of these mechanisms. In terms of dynamical systems theory, for example, inactivist approaches, but you still need a mechanism. You don't get free awareness of anything. There's no I think parapsychological capacities don't exist. I can't just read your mind, for example. I can't just by some magical means. And the same goes for self-awareness, for awareness of things about facts about ourselves, states of our own bodies. For example, I may have low blood sugar, but I don't know that unless I have some mechanism, some internal mechanism that can detect low blood sugar and respond to it. And the same indeed goes for mental states. I could have a certain emotion that I'm not aware of having. To be aware of what emotions I have, I need some introspective mechanism, some mechanism that can monitor my own mental states. As I say here, you can't know that you're in a certain state simply by being in it. You can't know that you're in a certain mental, a certain physical state, a certain physiological state simply by being in it. You can't know that you're in a certain psychological state simply by being in it. You've got to have needs to be some mechanism that tracks the states internally, perhaps, or perhaps you have to notice your behavior. I might realize that I'm angry, say, by noticing my behavior. There has to be some sort of mechanism. That's an assumption. That's just a starting point. I'm not arguing for that. I'm saying that's I think a very plausible starting point. It's kind of reflects everything we know about the way that biological systems work, the way that organisms work. Rocks aren't aware of things because they don't have mechanisms for detecting things. Biological organisms are aware of things because they do have these mechanisms. It's a fundamental fact about the world as we observe it. So I already said that. You need a mechanism to be aware of anything, including mental states, including your own mental states. Moreover, no mechanism affords perfect awareness. All mechanisms are selective. They're designed to do a certain job, to select certain, to provide information that's useful, whether they've been designed by artificial means or by natural selection. They've been designed to collect information that's useful to the creature that's using the mechanism. And so they're all partial, all distorting to some extent. And of course, they can misrepresent if the conditions aren't right or they're malfunctioning. But even when they're functioning perfectly normally, there can still be distortion, simplification, some degree of misrepresentation. We're only aware of our visual systems are only sensitive to a very narrow band of electromagnetic radiation. That's not a that's a limitation, but it's not a bad one, because we don't need to be sensitive to all of the wavelengths. Now, here's a little inference, a little bit of reasoning. If you seem to be aware of something scientifically inexplicable, it's more likely that you're misperceiving or misinterpreting your perceptions of something scientifically explicable. General principle that the world seems to be scientifically explicable. We expect things to be scientifically explicable. And if you seem to be aware of something that isn't, then it's more likely that you're misperceiving it than that it really is scientifically inexplicable. Optical illusions, good example, where the illusion of an impossible triangle, seeing that triangle that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, the sides are drawn in such a way that they curve back on themselves in a way that they couldn't in three-dimensional space. If you see that, it's something like that. And you can actually create a physical version of this, which, if you look at from the right angle, looks impossible. It's more likely that you're misperceiving what's really there than that you're really seeing something magical. Stage magic, of course, exploits this all the time. Now, it's a probabilistic inference. The one in the if you seem to be aware of something scientifically inexplicable, it's a probabilistic inference. It's not deductive. Maybe there are things that are scientifically inexplicable, but it's a plausible one, given what we know about the way the world works and how things are yielded pretty nicely to scientific explanation if we've stuck at it. And of course, it does depend on one's background probabilities. I mean, if you think that there's loads of stuff that's scientifically inexplicable, if you believe in the paranormal, for example, then you won't be impressed by this argument, because you'll be predisposed to accept that there are scientifically inexplicable things, and so you won't think that it's more probable. But if you share my background assumptions, you'll find that inference, at least in the first instance, on this, without strong counter evidence, you'll find it persuasive. No, that's really the argument for illusionism. I don't really need to say anything more. I could stop there, but let me just apply that to consciousness. We seem to be aware of a private world of mental qualities, phenomenal properties, qualia, whatever you want to call them, what it is, likenesses. We say experience is like something, and we interpret that as meaning that we're aware of strange properties called what it is likenesses that belong to our experiences, perhaps to our brain's states. And these do indeed seem to be scientifically inexplicable. That was something Philip was quite clear that he accepted, that science can't do this job. It's a philosophical job. We seem to be aware of something that's scientifically inexplicable, that poses a hard problem for science, perhaps not a hard problem for philosophy, but certainly science. So again, we just apply that little inference that I described. If you seem to be aware of something scientifically inexplicable, it's more likely that you're misperceiving or misinterpreting something scientifically explicable. So just apply that to the case of these strange qualities. When we seem to be aware of a private world of qualia, it's more likely that we are misperceiving or misinterpreting something else that is scientifically explicable, say patterns of brain activity. It's likely that these introspective mechanisms that are responsible for our awareness of our own experiences are misrepresenting their targets, the things they're tracking. Introspection can misrepresent just as as much as perception, as exteroception can, as perception can. We readily accept that there are perceptual illusions, optical illusions. We don't so readily accept that they're introspective ones, but maybe that's because there's no one to correct our introspective illusions. If something seems to me to be if I seem to be seeing an impossible triangle, someone can say, yes, but come and look at it from over here. It looks different from over here. There's no one else in our mind, in our heads, to tell us to come and look at our experiences from another perspective. We're stuck with one perspective. If that perspective is illusory, there's nothing we can do about it. At least nothing we can do about it simply by thinking about it and introspecting from the armchair. So it's more likely that qualia are illusory than that they're real. That's it. That's illusionism. Okay. Since I've got some more time, I will spell this out a little bit more for you. Give an illustration of how it works. That's it. I mean, it's not that wasn't a deductive argument. It's a probabilistic argument, an abductive inference to the best explanation. But it is, I think, what Daniel Dennett has called the obvious default theory of consciousness. If you're confronted with something that seems to be scientifically inexplicable, first of all, explore the possibility that your awareness of the thing is misleading. That you've not got a good grip on the thing you're trying to explain, rather than just assuming, yes, it's definitely the way it appears, because I have some sort of magical awareness of it that guarantees the accuracy of my beliefs about it, and then build a whole metaphysical framework around those beliefs. Why not at first explore the possibility, or at least alongside building those castles, explore the possibility that in some way introspection is misleading us. Okay, so let's just spell that out with a few pictures, which I think always help. So here we have a lady looking at an apple. This is literally a lady. This is Lady Monteagle, who was a lady in waiting to Jane Seymour, Henry V's third wife, I think. Portrait by Hans Holbein, a sketch by Hans Holbein the Younger. It's not relevant at all, but anyway. So she's looking at an apple. Now we know, very, very sketchy terms, what's happening here. The sense organs are generating streams of data. Light sensitive cells in her retina are firing, sending streams of data to various places in the brain by various routes, but a lot of it ends up in the visual cortex at the back of the brain. Their sensory processing systems interpret that data, look for patterns in it, detect features, edges, movement, colors, all sorts of things, different dedicated areas to extracting different features. Attention selects some of that information for global broadcast to other brain systems. Doesn't broadcast all of it, it's too much of it. Broadcasts bits that seem interesting. If she's hungry and she's looking for something to eat, then attention will probably focus on the apple. And then control systems in the brain. Without them, you use that for, in a very loose sense, for systems regulating physiological conditions, hormone levels, for example, alertness levels, those sorts of things. Whole raft of psychological systems, belief formation, desire formation, emotional systems for emotional processing, memory, association, all sorts. Motor responses will be primed, all sorts of stuff will happen, and there may be some overt behavioral responses to all sorts of stuff. So what we have is the cycle here of info, and of course those responses will then change the perceptual situation a little bit, and the cycle will repeat, and it's a continuing cycle of information and reaction. That's kind of what's going on when you have an experience, and that's what an experience is. Okay, at least that's what a neuroscientist will tell you experience is. So they would be appalled at the simplistic nature of the way I've presented it. Okay, so you have this cycle of information and reaction. Let's just simplify that a little bit even more. This is the most simple view of perception you can get, and we'll call that perceptual consciousness, because it's consciousness of things you perceive around you. We could also add a loop. I don't know if you can see my arrow, an internal loop here for perception of bodily awareness, perception of bodily states of various kinds, interoception, proprioception, nocioception, all these things. But I'll focus on, I'm focusing on visual perception here. So it's perceptual consciousness. Now, the thing is that there seems to be something extra occurring that isn't accounted for in that little crude sketch I gave you. There seems to be some, well, how do we describe it? There seems to be an internal aspect to this process, a private feel to it all, the feel of seeing the apple, the feel of the redness of the apple, shininess of the apple, the quality that you're aware of. I mean, the apple itself is, the apple here is in monochrome because it's, if you ask for a scientific description of the apple, these qualities won't be mentioned. What will be mentioned is a disposition to reflect light of a certain wavelength, that sort of thing. Or even though that's more complicated too. So it seems these qualities are in here somehow. The redness is somehow in here. And somehow, as well as all this information processing and all these reactive processes, there's this private feel that's generated. And this, of course, is what, and this seems to be a property, as I just said, this seems to be a property of us, not of the apple. Scientific description of the surface of the apple wouldn't mention this quality, would mention that there's a disposition to reflect light of, I can't remember the wavelength of red light. Is it about 550 nanometers? I'm not sure. And of course, we could have the apple qualia without the apple. We can hallucinate. Great dream, indeed. There we seem to be having the qualia without the actual apple. So these qualia seem to be in us. And so this is the hard problem. A hard problem for science, certainly, as Philip pointed out, maybe not such a hard problem if you go metaphysical on it. But then that's, to my mind, sort of the nuclear option. If something's difficult to explain scientifically, yes, you can go metaphysical. Yeah, and if a conflict's difficult to solve by peaceful negotiation, you can go nuclear. But maybe just, don't do it too soon. Okay. I see Philip smiling at that, I think, so that's good. Okay, so how does the brain create qualia? That's the hard problem. So here we have the situation where we seem to be aware of something scientifically inexplicable. Now, instead of confronting that head on, let's accept that. Let's accept that the brain does somehow create these qualia. Or perhaps that it assembles the microqualia, the microphenomenal properties of the particles that compose the brain, combines them all into this thing. Somehow it does this. Okay, let's assume that's right. Now let's ask this question: how are we aware of our qualia? Okay, so we'll assume that the realist is right, that there is this internal world, these properties, these qualia, phenomenal properties. How are we aware of them? Well, remember, there's no magical awareness of anything. Awareness requires a mechanism. Okay, so we're going to need some system which can detect qualia and send information about them to control systems, which will then generate reactions, including beliefs and reports about qualia. So Philip has a lot of beliefs about his qualia. He talks a lot about them. Those are reactions to his qualia, I assume. That. So if there's no magical awareness, he must have some system in his brain that detects his qualia and produces beliefs about them, enabling him to talk about them. And we'll call that, if you like, introspective consciousness. Now, I know that Philip won't accept this because he does believe in magical awareness, though he wouldn't call it that. He'd use perhaps a term like acquaintance, which is a Russellian term indeed, but is, I think, just shorthand, just a polite way of saying magical awareness. So introspective consciousness. Okay, so if we're realists about qualia and we accept that awareness requires a mechanism, we're going to need introspective consciousness. Now, let's go back to our original argument. We seem to be aware of qualia. Qualia are scientifically inexplicable. That's been granted. Little inference at the beginning. If you seem to be aware of something scientifically inexplicable, it's more likely that you're misperceiving or misinterpreting something scientifically explicable. So, conclusion, there are no qualia. Rather, introspection is misrepresenting something else as qualia. So the apple here has turned from the internal the private mental image of the apple painted with qualia. The qualia has disappeared. Now it's just some sort of brain representation, a sort of digital representation in the diagram. Some pattern of brain activity. I mean, I have a story about what that is, but that doesn't matter now. It's some aspect of neural activity involved in this first cycle of perceptual consciousness. Some aspect of that is being monitored by introspective consciousness and misrepresented as qualia. And of course, you still form your beliefs about qualia. You end up in the same place with all those beliefs about qualia, the conviction that there's something strange, mysterious, that can't be explained by science, that requires us to do metaphysical theorizing. You still, those beliefs are produced just the same. You end up in exactly the same epistemic situation as if they really were qualia. And so the name I've used for the properties that are actually being tracked by introspection and that are being misrepresented as qualia, I call them quasi-phenomenal properties. So whatever properties it is that are being tracked by introspection and producing beliefs about qualia. Quasi. I've also called them zero qualia, using a soft drink metaphor that I was once fond of. Okay, so I'm nearly there now. So the idea is that our brains trick us into thinking and reacting as if there are qualia. So you're completely convinced there are qualia. Qualia seem completely real to you in a way that a very, very vivid hallucination seems real to you. The hallucinated object seems real to you. A very, very vivid hallucination of a pink rabbit sitting on top of my bookshelves there. That would seem very real and convincing. Or I might rationally conclude that there wasn't really one there. Similarly, qualia seem very, very real and vivid to us, that this is an illusion. And indeed, there are very good reasons for thinking that the brain would create this kind of illusion, that it's a useful illusion, that it's doing something very important, that it's giving us a layer of control, an extra layer of control, of self-control. And this is something Daniel Dennett has written about. He talks about it as a user illusion and compares it to the illusion created by the graphical user interface on your computer with the icons. And so it gives you an extra layer of control. I'll talk more about that if you want, but I will keep it short now. And qualia are merely intentional objects. They're objects of our beliefs, thoughts, judgments, and so on. They are, if you like, comparable to fictions. Sherlock Holmes is merely an intentional object, but he's a very potent one in many ways. Our beliefs about Sherlock Holmes can provide a lot of enjoyment, pleasure, and motivate us in various ways. Be a subject of conversation. Intentional objects are still important things. They're just not things that we need to treat as on the same ontological, as having the same ontological status as tables and chairs and brains, and that's the illusion in illusionism. That's it. Now, coming to the end. So this is not, I want to stress, a denial of consciousness. We started off with a picture of Mary having an experience of the apple. Those things, that happens. People look at apples and they have experiences, okay? Conscious experiences, if you want to say. That's real. The question is, what's happening there? What seems to be happening when we describe the situation is that there is this, we're aware of this private inner world of qualia. Yes, and that's true. That's how it seems. The question is that really happening? The experience is happening. The question is, does the experience really involve qualia? And so illusionism is not a denial of consciousness, it's a denial of a certain account of what consciousness is. And it's a denial of that account, that really all that matters to be conscious is to have the appropriate qualia. Yes, there's all sorts of stuff going off in the brain, and that's all very, very important and relevant and maybe necessary, but the heart of consciousness is the qualia presentation, as it were. So that's the real that's the core of consciousness, and without it, you'd just be an unfeeling zombie. You'd be dead inside. You wouldn't be conscious at all. That's the picture that I reject. This is the picture that I accept. But I propose instead consciousness not as it was static qualia, but as dynamic engagement with the world through these processes of informational sensitivity and reaction. And I must stress that these processes are immensely complex, and we're only scratching the surface of their complexity, which is one reason I think why we're inclined to think that we're inclined to think that science can't explain this, because we don't have a grip on the complexity of the processes we're talking about. And as we start to unpick that complexity, I think we begin to lose our intuitions about it all being very simple and just as introspection presents it to us. So it's engagement with the world, but more than that, also an engagement with our own engagement with the world through introspective consciousness. We're not just sensitive to the world and reacting to the world, we're also sensitive to our own sensitivity, and we also react to our own reactivity through introspective consciousness. And that's where we get the illusion of there being something else going on. The something else is just a simplified, caricatured misrepresentation of this huge complexity of this, the huge complexity of this dynamic engagement, both with the world and with our engagement with, and with the complexity of this engagement with the world and with our own higher level engagement with that engagement. So that's what I offer you instead. I don't take consciousness away. I take away a certain, I think, simplistic and perhaps useful misrepresentation of what consciousness is, and offer you an alternative. And I don't do this because I'm dogmatically committed to thinking that science must explain everything, but because I think there's a very good chance that science does explain this, and we should not write it off prematurely. So let's get on with the work of mapping these engagements, these kinds of engagement, and then when we've made some progress, see how we feel about our intuitions then. Okay, so that's, here we go, Apple, and thank you.
We're going to start the discussion session by just giving each of our speakers an opportunity to ask each other a question, and then we'll move to taking questions from the audience. I noticed there are a number of people who posted questions in the chat already, and Philip has responded to some of the ones that were directed to him, so I'll sort of take those as dealt with and skip a little bit further down the list when I call on people. But also, if you want to ask a question, feel free to just type Q or question in the chat, and then I can call on you. But I'll go to let's say Philip first. Do you have any kind of question or comment you'd like to?
Okay, I'll try and be quick. I guess so that was really good. Oh, just firstly, Keith had a much nicer PowerPoint than me and has more full bookshelves. I've just moved into this office, which is what. So don't let that deceive you into thinking he's cleverer than me. And I've got no excuse for the poor PowerPoint. I need to up my skills on that. Anyway, that was really nice, Keith, laying out very clearly the argument. And I suppose that, so the crucial premise where there's awareness, there has to be a mechanism. I suppose I was wondering why you think that's true. What reason you have to think that's true? I mean, maybe you could take it as just a basic, you know, given that I take some things basic, I can't block you. It seems to me, for reasons I could expand on, it seems to be kind of an odd thing to take as basic. And so what is the reason for thinking that? I suppose you might think, well, in science, that seems to be the case. But then there's going to be a philosophical assumption there that if we're going to get your premise out of that, you know, the scientific story is the complete metaphysical story, which I suppose is what we're trying to argue. I mean, if you start from that, then you've got an even quicker argument to illusionism. So yeah, why do you adopt that? And I suppose I worry in a sort of scientific culture, it sounds very plausible, and especially when you label the opposing view magical, but it's not clear to me. Yeah. Why should we accept that premise?
Well, that's in every other instance. That seems to be how it works. Every other kind of awareness, except this awareness of qualia, there's a mechanism. I mean, awareness is a sort of sensitivity. Okay, awareness without sensitivity, awareness without the capacity to react, seems not sure I can even make sense of it. And I'm not sure I can make sense of sensitivity and reactivity without some mechanism that underlies it. So that's one point, that it almost seems to be built into the notion of awareness. But just more basically, give me another instance where we have awareness without a mechanism, including in the mental realm, apart from qualia. I can have, you know, we have everyone pretty much accepts that we have unconscious mental states. And I can have emotions that I'm not aware of. And when I am aware of them, it seems reasonable to think that there's some sort of introspective mechanism at work. I mean, I don't think you would deny that there are introspective mechanisms, but the brain does have its self-monitoring mechanisms. You just think we don't need them for this particular feature of our mental lives. I mean, you accept there's loads of psychological stuff going off that can be characterized in functional terms, right? I see. And to be aware of that, we need a mechanism. So there's just this one holdout where it seems that there's an exception to that general principle. And my thought isn't that there couldn't be an exception. Of course, there could be an exception, but isn't there more? Isn't it at least worth exploring the possibility that it isn't an exception? Maybe I could come back at that and ask my question to you. Do you think it's possible? Is there a possible alternative world in which introspective mechanisms are powerful enough to generate this sense that we have qualia without it being true? Could you imagine mechanisms that could convince you that you have qualia when you don't?
The problem in answering that question is, you know, I think thought and belief are grounded in consciousness. So, I mean, yeah, there could be a zombie who had, you know, functional states, the same functional states we have when we are aware of our experiences. But I think a zombie wouldn't really be thinking it's conscious, because a zombie doesn't think anything. It's just I think thought is a kind of consciousness. So that's what one trickiness. And I mean, I suppose part of your answer is, you know, you arguing whether acquaintance is incoherent. I mean, that would be a big discussion. But insofar as we're I mean, if we look at this idea that it just plugs this one gap, if we're looking from the perspective of physical science, yeah, we don't see acquaintance, but that's because physical science just looks at things from the outside and the causal connections from the outside. Of course, for the panpsychist, all of that is filled in with consciousness. So it's not just like plugging this one gap. So it's not surprising that we don't find acquaintance from the third person perspective. That it would be hard to see how we could, but so I'm not sure what epistemological ground. I'm doing a comeback on when I probably shouldn't be. Sorry.
Well, what it comes down to, I think, is whether we have this let's call it intuition. I don't know how we want to that this stuff is that we do have acquaintance, magical awareness with this inner world, and the question is, do we trust that intuition, or do we at least admit that it might be questionable? I mean, I agree that it's powerful. The intuition's powerful. I've never denied that, but illusion. I mean, I will stop because other people want to ask questions. But what's interesting to me is that you are prepared to question other intuitions that seem to me equally powerful, such as that there is an external world. You find you're not an idealist, but I think you would accept that idealism is a coherent position. It's a possible position that we can doubt that there's an external world. Now, that intuition seems to me at least as strong as the intuition that I'm internally presented with these things. In fact, in some ways, the colors seem to be more vividly out there than they are in here. So we've all, you know, intuition's a funny thing. But anyway, let's we talk enough. Let's have some other.
Yeah, maybe we should go to the questions.